Thank you, everyone, and I'll be introducing our speakers. So our speakers for today are Santiago Morán Izquierdo, he, they, who is based in Toronto, and Alex Kerner, he, him, who came from the Hamilton branch. And before I hand it over to the speakers, I'll just explain how the meeting will work. So the speakers will go first for a total of 30 minutes, and then we will have questions and comments from the audience. The speakers will respond to your questions and comments, but at the end, in their concluding remarks. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and I'll add you to the speakers list. I'll be using an equity speakers list, which means that I may not call on you in the sequence that you raise your hands, but I will prioritize Indigenous, Black, Conference of Color, women, and first-time speakers. Your questions and comments are welcome, but please try to keep your contribution to 3 minutes. This would allow for more contributions during the discussion. And finally, we encourage you to post on social media throughout the conference to share your thoughts and experiences. So please use the hashtag RedOctober2025. You can also tag Spring on all the platforms using @SpringMag.ca, so @SpringMag.ca. And now we will begin, and I'll give it over to the speakers. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So we're going to do things a little differently. We're going to do kind of a Q&A with ourselves as a bit of a conversation, just to be able to grapple with our topic. So to begin with, I'm going to ask the first question. So Santiago. So although Jose... I'm going to take these off because they'll look blurry otherwise. So although José Carlos Mariátegui has definitely gotten more attention in recent years, I imagine to many in this room and generally even among the left, he's still a relatively obscure figure of the Marxist tradition. So can you tell me a bit about Mariátegui's life and who he was?
So, José Carlos Mariátegui was born in Moquegua in 1894, which is a city in Peru. His mother was of indigenous origins, and his father a European with an aristocratic lineage. His father was mostly absent, leaving his mother to take care of him and his 5 siblings. When he was 8, he suffered an injury in the schoolyard that left him mostly bedridden for the next 4 years. During those 4 years, and the many years to come, he spent his time immersed in books. Eventually, even though he never graduated from school, he got a job at a liberal newspaper reporting on international news, which he received through cable, and operating the linotype. However, he climbed his way up the ranks at the paper, quickly securing his own column. One of Mariátegui's friends took him to meet a popular anarchist figure in Lima, Manuel González Prada. This man, although not the most rigorous thinker, was the first person to put the indigenous cause at the center of political discourse in a public stage. At the same time, he made friends with people in the avant-garde literary circles in Lima, and these 2 events would radicalize his opinions on revolutionary art and aesthetics and his promotion of indigenous art. Eventually, Mariátegui moved on to a more radical newspaper, although it was soon shut down by the government. And this was not the last time this would happen to a newspaper that he was involved with. The military was angered by the anti-militarist articles in a newspaper that he had founded, so they arrested him. And the press where the paper was printed shut his staff out. That didn't stop him, though. He got out of jail quickly and started a new paper, La Razón, meaning reason. This time, it was explicitly socialist. His paper's support for the workers led to this anecdote. In 1919, on May Day, a national strike calling for an 8-hour workday and affordable groceries began. Its 3 leaders were quickly arrested. Mariátegui's paper, all the while, supported the strike. Even though it was put down quickly, within a month, the strike was renewed. Soon after, the leaders of the strike were released from prison, and the government gave in to the demands for the 8-hour workday, although the workers would have to put in a lot of effort to keep the government from walking back on this promise. The leaders' release was celebrated in the streets, and a march formed that walked throughout Lima. The march's first stop was the office to Mariátegui's newspaper, where they picked him up and the other editors and carried them through the streets on their shoulders. He would go on to promote radical politics and indigenous art every chance he got, including in his own magazine, Amauta, which means teacher in Quechua. Amauta is the nickname that Mariátegui's followers would go on to lovingly call him. Before getting into Mariátegui's main contributions to Marxism, can you try to situate where Marxism was around the time he rose to prominence in Peru?
So I think to understand where Mariátegui's ideas fit into the larger Marxist tradition and how he came to those ideas, it's essential to understand what dominant ideas on the left were prior to his own embrace of Marxism. So before the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Marxism that dominated Europe, where the ideas mostly found their home at that time, were those of the Second International, which is a coalition of socialist parties that affiliated from around mostly Europe, but there were some international sections beyond. Although the likes of Friedrich Engels helped found the International in 1889, the philosophical underpinnings of the organization were driven by the political developments of social democracy, which quickly grew in size around the turn of that century and also grew more conservative as the parties got closer to power. So as we talk about in other sessions that we can point you to, social democracy seeks to work within the confines of the capitalist state and use the state to bring about change. This is very different than the radical tradition of socialism from below, and it is a tradition that accepts working within the limitations of capitalism. So when capitalism goes into economic crisis, social democracy advocates or accepts austerity in hopes that it will reinvigorate the economy and offer the possibility of reforms at a later date. When capitalism goes to war, social democracy often advocates for critical, if not uncritical, support for their own capitalists in hopes that its victory could offer war plunders to their working class at a later time. The almost unanimous support among the Second International leaders for the First World War is an example of this. So, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the kinds of ideas that dominate socialist theory pre-1917 reflect this kind of conservative political trajectory. The most relevant to where Mariátegui and where he comes in and challenges is this mechanical idea of societal and historical progress. The idea was that societies develop through stages and must go through each stage before moving on. So simplistically, that means that human society develops initially from a primitive communist setup that leads eventually to economies based on slavery, that lead to feudalism and serfdom, that lead to capitalism, then lead to socialism, that leads to communism. And you can't skip steps. And that has enormous implications for radical political forces outside of the industrial West, because outside of a few economies at this time, namely the UK, Germany, and France, and maybe the United States, most economies are still largely rural and peasant-driven. So if your economy is feudal or semi-feudal with only very small working class in much larger urban centers, you can't set socialism as an immediate political goal. You need to achieve the victory of your local bourgeoisie, your local capitalist, and then begin capitalist development before contemplating the move to socialism. I'm sure Santi's going to provide some background on what this looks like in Peru, but it's important to note that this is the dominant idea of social change among the Marxist left. Trotsky develops his idea of permanent revolution, which I think there's a session on, or it already happened. It already happened? It's right now. So effectively, he develops this idea of permanent revolution in the aftermath of the 1905 Russian Revolution. This was like the first revolution in Russia. And this idea is that even a numerically small working class can lead the peasantry past the bourgeois stage and straight to socialism. But at this time, Trotsky still remains a very small minority, even among Russian revolutionaries. The Bolsheviks actually don't embrace this idea until the summer of 1917, when Lenin returns to Russia in April and slowly wins the party over, to the idea that the proletarian revolution is possible and necessary in Russia. So in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, there's this burst of creativity in Marxism. The cold mechanics of the Second International are thrown away for ambitious and novel ideas about how social transformation can happen. In Europe, we have more known figures like Gramsci and Lukács, but I'd argue that Mariátegui falls within this tradition, this creative burst after 1917, and essential to where he eventually gets to is this idea that even in largely rural society, the proletariat and the peasantry can form a political alliance, and they do not have to limit themselves to carrying out the political and economic victory of the bourgeoisie. So, saying that, Santiago, can you tell us how Mariátegui embraced Marxism and took these developments in Marxist theory and applied them to the Peruvian context?
Yeah. So, like I alluded to earlier, by the way, am I holding the microphone correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. So like I alluded to earlier, some of Mariátegui's earlier influence were highly unorthodox. He didn't come from academia, and the Marxist and communist movement in Peru was largely underdeveloped when compared to Europe, or even to some other Latin American countries like Argentina. As such, his early influences were anarchists, idealists, humanists, artists, bohemians, and poets. However, while these movements and their figureheads were highly suspicious of the Bolshevik Revolution, Mariátegui remained curious about them, which led to his trip to Europe and his discovery of Marxism. Still, there were many different catalysts that pushed Mariátegui to Marxism, including the growing militancy of the trade union movement in Peru, the explosion of the student movement across Latin America, the economic crisis in Peru after losing the War of the Pacific, and President Augusto Leguia's authoritarianism. To Mariátegui, all of these events brought to the fore the existence and importance of class war and class struggle. To Mariátegui, the only framework that would successfully explain these events and their history was dialectical materialism, which he discovered during his trip to Europe in 1919. He spent most of his time in Italy, where he took part in the burgeoning communist movement, highly influenced and emboldened by the Bolshevik Revolution. He witnessed the rise of Mussolini and fascism and how the socialist movement became less militant and less committed to revolution. He also noted that the splits between the communist leadership and the working class movement contributed to the downfall of the socialist movement in Italy. And he had traveled by ship from Lima to New York to Paris and eventually to Italy. He spent 2 years in Italy before returning to Peru through Germany, Belgium, and France again. And he had planned on going to Moscow to see the Bolshevik Revolution with his own 2 eyes, but he had to return to Lima to take care of his wife and newborn son. Returning to Lima as a committed Marxist, he applied dialectical materialism to Peru's history, which led to the articles that would comprise his seminal book, 7 Interpretive Essays on Peruvian Reality. This book is a perfect example of his idea of Marxism as a framework. He did not return from Italy as a Bordeguist or as a Gramscian, applying their ideas about Italy to a country with a different history. He returned from Italy having read Lenin and learned how he had applied dialectical materialism to Russia and having seen how Gramsci did the same to Italy. And he had witnessed in Italy a society that was highly industrialized after World War I, which meant the possibility of a revolutionary proletariat. In Peru, as Mariátegui would be quick to point out, this was not the case. Peru had, and still does, a majority mestizo and indigenous population. Mestizo is mixed. Large swaths of this population were living under conditions similar to indentured servitude. Described by Eduardo Galeano in his own seminal book, Open Veins of Latin America, some of these people were purposefully sold alcohol on credit so they would become addicted, which would lead to greater and greater debt, which they would eventually have to pay off with their labor. Mariátegui's examination of the modes of production in Peru led him to realize that the bourgeois revolution hadn't exactly done away with feudalism, it had simply modified it. The masses of Peru had not been proletarianized. Indigenous people were still largely living like serfs, and they were being paid with a little bit of land to feed their families, or by forgiving debts, or by being given store credit at the landlord's own store. Once foreign capital took control of Peru's industry and agriculture, this was after the War of the Pacific, this exploitation would feed the profits of American and British capitalists. This led him to declare post-independence Peru not as a colonial or post-colonial society, but rather as a semi-colonial society. But Mariátegui's historical analysis also led to some interesting new perspectives. He utilized historical findings that were new at the time to analyze the political economy of the Incan Empire and used Marxist ideas about so-called primitive communism to justify a sort of Incan socialism. While there was a centralized government during the time of the Incas, and it was described as authoritarian, communal ownership of the land was still in place, even under this empire. And local communes were the building blocks of the empire. It wasn't perfect, and many people interpret Mariátegui's words as saying that, oh, this was a perfect society. But that wasn't the point of his argument. He wanted to build a specifically Peruvian socialism, which is why he wrote another book called Let's Peruvianize Peru. As an aside, I believe this is a very historical materialist thing to do. It was Marxism as a science and as a revolutionary tool applied to Peru. The concept of Peruvianizing Peru implies sort of like this idea that we have now of like decolonizing, right? Ridding Peruvian thought and culture of the ideas that were brought over during the Conquista and the American-British imperialism that followed it. Mariátegui wrote about this idea between 1925 and 1929, before thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Edward Said popularized it in their own different contexts. Looking for a way to Peruvianize socialism, Mariátegui looked at the Incas. He wanted to inform our vision of the future based on how our past functioned, but obviously only taking the good things as a dialectical materialist would.
I'll ask another question. So can you tell us a little bit more about how then Mariátegui takes all these ideas and begins to put them in practice in Peru, especially in terms of building a political organization?
Yes.
Can you get another drink of water?
Give me 1 second. Well, Mariátegui took a look at Peru's material reality. The fact that the proletariat was not industrialized nor particularly proletarianized, the fact that there was a class as well as racial oppression of indigenous people, the fact that in Europe, reformism had failed to stand up to fascism, the fact that as a nation, Peru is still subordinated to the imperialist countries, and he came up with the idea of a united front, which I don't know if you guys were upstairs, but we just had a talk on that, Trotskyist formation, right? The task of the united front was to unite all the oppressed across the country under one organization, or one sort of collection of organizations. And it would fight for the industrial proletariat, the export agriculture workers, the highland peasants who were majority indigenous. They were all being exploited by the capitalists, both nationally and internationally. But they saw themselves as very different classes. In his declaration for a united front, he reminds the listener of Marx's words, "Workers of the world unite." And as one of Mariátegui's friends and collaborators, César Miró, put it, having the support of the urban proletariat without the support of the agrarian peasantry and the indigenous communities was like having the hammer without the sickle. I have here what Mariátegui said to those who opposed this policy, and this is my translation. So if it's wrong,
We'll hold you to it.
yes. While responding to the first bouts of resistance and apprehension from some older and more fanatical libertarians, those who were more worried about the rigidity of their dogma than with efficiency and abundance of action, I have said to them, atop the platform of the popular university, we are still too few to be divided. Let us not make an issue out of labels and titles. He also realized that regardless of the ideology, much of the left had the same tasks to do. The proletariat was not class conscious. The proletariat was joining opportunist and reformist factions. Reactionary repression against the left was running rampant. Free speech was under attack. Lesser forms of slavery, but slavery nonetheless, had not been abolished. These tasks and challenges belonged to the socialist and the syndicalist, the communist and the anarchist. They shared the same goal of tackling these challenges, so Mariátegui wanted them to unite for the foreseeable future against the common enemy of petty bourgeois reformism and reactionary nationalism. Putting theory to practice, Mariátegui started his own movement, which rallied behind his new magazine, Amauta. And of course, in this course of his attempt to build this united front, he came into some problems. The APRA, Peru's reformist, opportunist, and electoral party, still around to this day, was founded by Raúl Aya de la Torre, a contemporary of Mariátegui. They were colleagues as younger activists, but the two parties, and they collaborated at first, but eventually it became evident that their lines were too different to keep collaborating. The APRA claimed that it could not function as, quote, exclusively the party of just one class, and began collaborating with the petty and national bourgeoisie. Other disagreements included the fact that the APRA thought they needed a second revolution without needing to rid Peru of capitalism, and that they could collaborate with the imperialist economies. This led to a very public split in 1928, the year in which Mariátegui would form the Socialist Party of Peru, as well as the Workers' General Confederation of Peru, which to this day is the largest trade union federation in the country. Unfortunately, Mariátegui would soon succumb to illness and pass away 2 years later, days away from a trip to Argentina where he would have received treatment. However, as we will discuss, his ideas lived on without him. Now that we have a sense for the kind of Marxism that Mariátegui is embracing and arguing for, what kind of influence do his ideas have outside of Peru and the rest of Latin America?
Well, here's part of the tragedy of his ideas. I already discussed one bookend, the mechanical stagist Marxism of the Second International. And unfortunately for Mariátegui, the other bookend is, of course, Stalinism, which arguably reintroduced very mechanical ideas about historical development, just as the more fluid and creative Marxism inspired by the Russian Revolution was still in its early stages. Mariátegui's rise as a theoretician of the Latin American left happens in the mid to late 1920s, just as the battles are happening inside Russia between Stalin and numerous other factions. Stalin isn't completely victorious until 1929, but well before the idea of socialism in one country begins to gain traction as the Russian Revolution remained isolated and other revolutions in Germany and Hungary are defeated. The idea around his faction being that in isolation, you can build socialism, and this would require an accelerated industrial development carried out without the assistance of the advanced economies. Although in the mid-1920s, it's very unclear what this exactly would look like, but by the 1930s, we know that the rapid industrialization of Russia happens through forced collectivization of the rural economy over the objections of the peasantry. And far from the ideas that the rural peasantry could be an important agent of change, an intrinsic part of a proletarian revolution, the peasantry becomes a pure object of historical forces. And this is far from the ideas that Mariátegui is developing, but it is in this context that his ideas found themselves in. Santi's already given some background of the political formations in Peru and the founding of the Peruvian Socialist Party in 1928. In June of 1929, the communist parties, or parties that have demonstrated loyalty or connection to the Russian Revolution, hold a meeting in Buenos Aires for the first and what ends up being the only time. Mariátegui does not attend personally, but his fellow comrades do, and in preparation for these meetings, Mariátegui produced a series of ideological interventions that spoke to the problems of building a revolutionary movement in Latin America, interventions that would face pushback from Russia or those carrying Russia's water in Latin America. The first of these is a document entitled The Problem of Race in Latin America that dealt with the interaction of race and class in Peru. He notes that in Latin America, there is a correlation between class and race, with large sections of the working class being racially oppressed as well. While the ruling class was almost universally white, the latter using race as a way to divide the working class. The document also sought to point out that the uneven class experiences of the the Peruvian indigenous community, while largely rural, also had many members who worked as day laborers in the cities or in the mines as wage laborers. Mariátegui argues that this experience, we coordinated that. We worked on that for a while. So the experience with wage labor could build working class and socialist consciousness to the experience of agricultural labor. And the thrust of this argument being that even though the indigenous community was largely rural, they could also be part of the revolutionary vanguard, a leading part of the process of socialist revolution. And while tying it back to the question of race, it was through adopting this revolutionary perspective, by being part of the same revolutionary process, that prejudices inside the working class towards the indigenous population, who are the vast majority of the laboring classes in Peru, could be overcome. Segueing from this, Mariátegui's essay sought to address the question of who would lead socialist revolution in Latin America. And as Santiago noted already, Mariátegui brought a broad understanding of who the revolutionary subject was, asserting that the party they were building in Peru aimed to be the clasista organization of workers and peasants. Socialist organizing involved the urban and rural proletariat, and to quote, the working masses of the city, the countryside, mining camps, and indigenous peasants whose interests and aspirations we represent in political struggle. Mariátegui still saw the leading role of the urban working class, but recognized an alliance with rural laborers was essential in places like Peru, whose population was still largely rural. By the time the Buenos Aires meeting happens, Stalinist thought, however, was asserting itself in international sections of the Comintern being, the Third International. And this results in trepidation and hostility toward the positions Mariátegui was putting forward. This is during an infamous period called the Third Period of the Comintern, where Moscow was arguing that revolution was on the immediate horizon and was directing its international affiliates to take ultra-leftist positions towards anyone to their right, including social democratic parties. And this would inevitably alienate parties to its right, including mass organizations, whether social democratic parties, but also social democratic controlled unions. So heading into this 1929 meeting, the Russian-aligned delegates trying to gain signatures denouncing the Spanish revolutionary Andrea Nin of Trotskyism, and also to pass a motion denouncing the Peruvian rival Aprismo. The Peruvian delegate, although not including Mariátegui because he didn't come, it was still influenced by him and he had prepped them for this meeting. They refused to sign these documents or to denounce. They didn't want to be a part of a stampede denouncing Nin, nor did they want to take such an absolute political position, which they were sympathetic to because they're critical of Aprismo, but they didn't want to they wanted to debate the matter at home before signing on to any sort of broad denunciation. So having put itself in the Comintern's crosshair for these challenges, Mariátegui's papers, which were presented at the conference, were not warmly received. Additionally, prior to this conference, the Comintern, in the midst of the third period, began advocating for the creation of separate republics for racially and ethnically oppressed groups. It was we can have a whole talk on this idea, these theories, but it was effectively a largely clunky theory that was not actually driven by any demands of these groups themselves, but it was an imposition from Russia saying this is what you need to do. The most well known of this is in the United States. The Communist Party in the USA started to embrace what was called a black belt theory, which was the idea that African Americans in the American South could form their own state. Again, this wasn't an idea actually embraced or driven by African American comrades. It was largely driven by white comrades, but what it did do in the United States, arguably, it forced a largely white organization to take African American struggles seriously in the 1930s, and it resulted in a lot of good work on behalf of the party. In Peru, however, with 80% of the population being indigenous, Mariátegui and his followers were already centering indigenous struggles and saw them as intrinsic and integrated with the fight for socialism. So they didn't embrace this idea that was being pushed on them by Moscow. So again, because he pushed back against Moscow, Mariátegui's contributions were scorned, and the immediate impact they could have had beyond his group of supporters and outside of Brazil was limited. He dies in April of 1930, and within months, the Peruvian Socialist Party changes its name to the Peruvian Communist Party, with pro-Moscow forces taking control. In the midst of a big worker struggles that year, there's a series of strikes. The state decides to outlaw the party, and it remains underground and marginal for decades, leaving much of Mariátegui's concerted efforts of building a socialist movement in Peru unfulfilled.
Despite this, his ideas and influence did not completely disappear. Can you give us a bit of a sense how Mariátegui's influence continued in the decades after his death, and even more recently with the Pink Tide movements in Latin America?
Okay, yes. And as you can see from our timer, we're close to our end, but we'll try to be quick. Well, there certainly was a period where Mariátegui's ideas were buried, both by the Peruvian dictatorship and the Peruvian Communist Party, both seeing his ideas as threatening to the regime and also to Stalinist orthodoxy. And it meant that many of his writings didn't get republished or wide audiences. There is some evidence to suggest that one of Mariátegui's old comrades, a man by the name of Hugo I misspelled it, who had been a delegate to the 1929 conference, had exposed Che Guevara to Mariátegui's ideas when he was biking across Latin America. And after the Cuban Revolution, the new regime did print runs of his 7 essays, which is the first mass publication of his work after initial publication. It's very significant to getting his ideas rediscovered. It was also an opportune time for his ideas to re-emerge. The 1956 Soviet crushing of the Hungarian uprising resulted in a mass exodus from communist parties around the world, with many intellectuals abandoning Stalinism. And it's in the 1960s that the emergence of a new left in Europe rediscovers the likes of Antonio Gramsci and Giorgio Lukács, and in Latin America, a rediscovering of Mariátegui. Again, you can have a whole talk in it, but we'll fast forward to the Latin American challenges to neoliberalism that we've talked about, this idea, this pink tide that emerges in the first 25 years of this century, both electorally and in the streets. Mariátegui's ideas have continued to resonate. Many of the grassroots movements that resist and have resisted the tide of neoliberal economic hegemony in the region were led by indigenous, urban, and rural workers. A multitude of concerns animated these movements, from the worsening conditions of the poor to the concentrated efforts of corporations to destroy the environment. And Mariátegui's ideas resonated with the left that emerged. His ideas about race and indigeneity, offering useful frameworks about the kinds of kind of movement needed to be built to challenge the capitalist structures of Latin America. Now, we can obviously debate the shortcomings of these governments that are elected on the backs of these movements, but that isn't isn't to lessen the importance of Mariátegui's ideas and what they continue to have. So, saying that, can you, Sandy, can you finish us off by give us an idea, your feelings about what use Mariátegui's ideas have to socialists today in Turtle Island, and how we can apply his theory and praxis in our context?
Yeah, so the first thing we have to recognize is what we have already stated quite a few times, right? Mariáteguismo is Marxism, historical materialism, applied to the Peruvian context. So-called Canada, of course, is a very different conjuncture. In Peru, indigenous and mixed-race people make up a much larger percent of the population. So for Mariátegui, it was easy to convince trade union leaders that it was not just the correct moral choice, but also the correct tactical choice. Here, the settler proletariat and indigenous communities are stratified in a very different manner. However, we can take the frameworks he came up with and apply with, what works into our situation. And so a united front between indigenous people and the proletariat is not only possible, it is a necessity for the liberation of all people oppressed by the Canadian state and national bourgeoisie. This united front must not stop here, though. It must also include migrant workers, racialized minorities, and women, among others. It must also be internationalist and anti-imperialist while being cautious and suspicious of petty bourgeois elements in capitalist movements around the globe. Have I been speaking really quickly? To conclude, Mariátegui was a very creative and innovative Marxist, but turning his theories into a dogma for us to follow would fly into the face of what he stood for. What we must do instead is take inspiration and guidance from his life and work and create our own interpretive essays on Canadian reality, if you will, as well as our own united front. Thank you.